So prescription drugs are the third leading cause of death. There are several studies that show about the same. Some people say it's the fourth leading cause of death. It doesn't matter. We kill a lot of people with our drugs anyhow. And I described why in this book I published, Deadly Medicines and Organized Crime, how Big Pharma has corrupted healthcare. So we have created a society that looks like the man at the bottom, all about drugs. And it is really an epidemic. 8 million daily doses in Denmark, and we are 5.5 million, so everybody can get more than one drug every day from they are born till they die. But of course, some get more drugs than others, and 1 of 8 get at least 5 drugs every day. And these people are mostly the elderly who tolerate drugs most poorly. That doesn't make any sense. And just to take one of them, arthritis drugs, 1 of 8 Danes get one every year, and they're highly lethal. When I worked in the drug industry many years ago, I did research on naproxen, and one day I read the package insert, and I said, my goodness, a drug that can kill me in so many different ways, I will never take it for the rest of my life, any anti-arthritis drug, and I haven't done that. So these drugs are used for virtually everything, back pain, knee pain, migraine, whatever you can think of. It's absolutely insane. Now, the companies cheated with their data. Merck, as you know, concealed cases of myocardial infarction and even death with rofecoxib. And Pfizer denied that their drug caused heart attacks at an FDA hearing in 2005, despite they had unpublished evidence to the contrary. And they still called the evidence inconclusive in 2009 when they recruited people also in Denmark to take part in a trial. They said, we don't know if it causes heart attacks. They did. So by 2004, Vioxx had likely killed 120,000 people and Pfizer's drug 75,000. It's not only these drugs. Now we all know that diclofenac and ibuprofen, which can be bought over the counter in most countries, they also double the risk of heart attacks. So what do FDA do about this? Well, the FDA approach to safety is virtually to disregard it. The FDA believes there is no risk that cannot be managed in the post-marketing setting, and the European Medicines Agency, unfortunately, copies the FDA. They say the same. So they say, we can't be 95% certain that this drug will kill you, so therefore we will allow it on the market, assuming it doesn't. Imagine if you were a doctor and give a drug to a patient and say, I'm not 95% sure it will kill you, so go home and take it, and if you wake up next morning, tell me how it went. It's David Graham, Associate Director of FDA's Office for Drug Safety. He has worked there for more than 40 years, who said that. So the FDA approved Vioxx because it lacked complete certainty that the drug increased cardiovascular risk, although this was known all the time based on the mechanism of action. We knew this drug causes thrombosis. The FDA didn't care. The EMA didn't care. So it's a bit like I'm going to prescribe something that works like aspirin but costs much, much more. If only doctors were more honest, they wouldn't kill so many people. Then we also have psychiatry. I got involved in that 9 years ago because someone wanted to do a PhD with me. And antidepressant drugs, we take so many in Denmark so everyone can be in treatment for 6 years of our life. This is totally insane. And sales are closely related to the number of drugs on the market. So it's marketing pressure. It's not evidence-based medicine. Every time a new drug comes on the market, you have a new sales force that travel around to doctors, say, use SSRIs for everything. And this is what they do. Divorce, poor marriages, husband drinks too much, husband is worried not to earn too much money for the family, failed a test at school, nervous to go to exams, whatever. Yes, we have a happy pill for you. And even husbands who beat up their wives, then you can give a happy pill to the wife, and you can give one to the husband who is violent. This has happened. It happens in my country, and these drugs increase the risk of violence. So wonderful. Give these violent males a drug that increases the risk he will beat up his wife. It's absolutely incredible what happens. Studies have shown that in many, many cases there is no good indication for using these drugs, but still doctors do it, and it's generally general practitioners who do this. So we can't find anything wrong with you, so we are going to treat you for symptom deficit disorder. This is about where we are with antidepressant drugs. Now, we cannot practice evidence-based medicine when we don't know about the deaths. And the deaths are missing to a huge extent. Trial registers were compared with the first standalone journal article, and 62% of deaths and half of the suicides, they were simply missing. They were gone. They were not in the journal articles, and these were antipsychotics and an ADHD drug and 2 antidepressant drugs. So doctors think that psychiatric drugs are much more safe than they really are. So I published a book about this last year where I concluded that psychiatric drugs alone are also the third major cause of death after heart disease and cancer. Maybe I'm not right, but I will give you the basis for my views in a minute. And I also calculated that psychiatric drugs kill 500,000 Americans and Europeans every year. Drugs that affect your brain are dangerous for the elderly because they can lose balance, fall, break their hip, and 1/5 will die when they break their hip. And here is the best study I could find from BMJ. A cohort study of people at least 65 years of age showed that these drugs lead to falls. And for every 28 people treated for 1 year, there was 1 additional death. That's a death rate of 3.6%. That's very high. There are other studies that are not so well done, where there's much more noise, so the death rate was lower. This is the best one I could find. And also, middle-aged people who were completely normal have committed suicide or homicide or both on antidepressant drugs. So I have come to the conclusion these drugs are not safe at any age. Then the way psychiatric drug trials are being done, most often you take people who are already in treatment with a drug, then you have a short washout period of up to 1 week where they don't get anything, then you randomize to placebo or a similar drug. What happens in the placebo group? You harm the people whom you randomize to placebo because some of them get cold turkey symptoms. They get abstinent. These cold turkey symptoms can be for antidepressant drugs, psychosis, akathisia, which is an extreme form of restlessness that predisposes to violence, emotional blunting, I don't care much about myself or others, and such things. And we know, for example, for antipsychotics that this design is very lethal. 1 in every 145 patients who entered the trials died, but none of these deaths were mentioned in the scientific literature, and the FDA didn't require them to be mentioned, so they were just gone. So how can we find out how lethal antipsychotic drugs are? We cannot use trials in schizophrenia because almost all of them have a cold turkey design where you harm the placebo group. So I thought, well, look to the old people. Maybe they didn't get an antipsychotic drug before they were randomized. So that I did. So there are some trials in patients with dementia, and for every 100 people treated, there was 1 additional death. And these trials were short-term. And as deaths are usually missing from published trial reports, it might be worse than 1 in 100. So yes, antipsychotics kill people, but some psychiatrists will tell you that they actually make people survive based on very poor observational studies. Don't believe in them. They kill people. Now, then I tried to estimate how many people are killed by psychiatric drugs. And for antipsychotics, you just saw my estimate, 1% in short-term trials. Benzodiazepines, also the best observational studies I could find, 1%. Antidepressants, it was 3.6%, but I wanted to be conservative, so I said, well, let's say 2% and not almost 4%. And what I got out of that, because so many people are in treatment with antidepressants all over the world, we kill 3,693 people in Denmark every year. And when I multiply that, it comes up to 500,000 in United States and Europe. Now, here is one example of how unreliable the evidence is. Suicides. Suicide risk is far worse than what the FDA has reported. The FDA reported 5 suicides in 50,000 patients on active drug. That's 1 per 10,000. But in some of the trials I have looked at, there were more suicides, 9 in just 7,000. And these trials were included in the big meta-analysis, and 5 on another drug, paroxetine. So these 2 drugs made 14 suicides. So already there, 9 suicides are missing. How can you get away with suicides? No problem in evidence-biased medicine. No problem at all. Thomas Logren, the FDA guy who was chairing the big meta-analysis that found very few suicides, 5 years before he published his own review where he then found more suicides based on the same material, 10 per 10,000. That's really something. The same guy published 10 times as many suicides 5 years earlier, but when it was a burning issue for the FDA and the drug industry, then the suicides went away. So my conclusion is there's likely to have been 15 times more suicides. That's an error of 1,400%. And one of the smart ways of getting rid of suicides is only to include suicides that occur up to 24 hours after the randomized phase is over. What happens after 24 hours? People get a cold turkey and some kill themselves in akathisia, okay? What happens in clinical practice? In clinical trials, psychiatrists do all they can to have compliance with the drug. What do people do in practice? They may go for a weekend and forget their drugs. They may forget to take it on work. And if you miss just 1 dose of paroxetine, you can develop akathisia. Just 1 dose. So in clinical practice, if these trials are to reflect clinical practice, we must, of course, include what happens after 24 hours. And if you include that, you will get many, many more suicides. I have that on some other slides I won't show you today. And there were lots of other biases. People who got agitated and developed akathisia were put on benzodiazepines to calm them down. What does that mean? Less risk of suicide. That's not what happens in clinical practice when you forget to take a dose to work. Finally, in all these trials, only people at low risk of suicides were recruited. Now, if the drug industry had believed that these drugs prevent suicide, they would not have found people at low risk. If you have a cardiovascular drug that helps people survive, you will not study it in footballers, would you? You would study it in old people who get myocardial infarction. So the drug industry didn't believe in what they told the public. They knew perfectly well what the truth was. Okay, so these drugs are pretty deadly. Do they have any benefits? I actually doubt that. Now, the effect is measured on very subjective scales like Hamilton, so it's important the studies are adequately blinded, which they are not. But one of my colleagues did a study on all diseases that had blinded and non-blinded outcome assessors because he wanted to see how much the non-blinded outcome assessor exaggerate the effect. And that was pretty much 36% on average. So if you break the blinding in the antidepressant trials, the 10% difference in effect becomes 0. And you don't need to break the blinding in very many if this leads to misclassification before the effect is 0. And there is a very important Cochrane review where people put something in the placebo in order to have a better blinding. Atropine gives you dry mouth, constipation, blurred vision, and so on, just like the drugs. And what happened here, 9 trials and so on, I have recalculated the effect. That's 1 on the Hamilton scale. That's absolutely nothing, because 5 to 6 is the bare minimum that you can perceive as a change. So 1 is nothing. And what you can barely perceive as a change is not even clinically relevant. It needs to be bigger than 5 to 6. So despite all these biases that the trials are not adequately blinded, what do the patients say in these trials? Well, the psychiatrists say that the drugs work, standardized mean difference 0.25. The patients say they don't work in the same trials. That's a Hamilton of only a half. And also the old drugs, it's about the same. So we're not treating psychiatrists, we're treating patients. And they say the drugs don't work. And here is another study, week by week, severely depressed, mildly depressed. It just takes a little longer if you get placebo, even though these studies are not adequately blinded. So what do I conclude? We need, I'm sorry for all this, comes in a little after. I didn't plan for this. Oh, so here you have it all. Truly independent evaluation of drugs, blinding during data analysis and writing of papers, and blinded placebos that contain something that gives people side effects. Large long-term trials before marketing approval. To get the industry out of medical education, to ban marketing on drugs like we have done for tobacco. It's highly lethal. A major culture change in health research. The data are ours and belong to us. Access to trial protocols, study reports, and raw data, all the usual things. And then my last slide. I always tell patients, read the package insert before you go to the pharmacy, then you might not dare buy the drug. And when you think you're getting old, it could very well be side effects. People very rarely get that idea, so maybe you should stop your drugs. Use drugs as little as possible. A life without drugs is possible. For many of us, even those of us who are age 65 plus. And then the huge death toll translates into a general practitioner on average kill 1 patient every year with drugs. Most of them didn't even need. You don't need arthritis drugs usually. You can do nothing or use paracetamol. You don't need antidepressant drugs. You need at most 2% of the psychiatric drugs we use today, and then many more people would survive and be happier. So what the hell are we doing? Thank you.